Hello, everyone. Welcome to another screening series Q&A. My name is Armando Zamudio. I am the Public Programs and Events Coordinator here at IDA. For our blind and low vision attendees, I'm going to identify myself. I have a black t-shirt, a white striped button-up, messy hair, light brown skin, and a white backdrop. I want to start by thanking our media sponsors, Variety and KCRW, for sponsoring our 2022 screening series. This evening, we'll have a conversation between film critic Claudia Puig, directors Emma Pildes, and Tia Lessin, whose film The JANES world premiered at Sundance 2022. For more information or to see more amazing films like this, please visit www.documentary.org/screening-series. To help us grow by donating and or interested in joining IDA's global network of documentary professionals, please visit documentary.org/membership. Now, before we start the Q&A, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Chumash as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Andrea Lust, for ASL interpreting this discussion. And with that, I pass it to Claudia. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claudia Puig. I'm president of the LA Film Critics Association. For the blind and low vision attendees, I'm wearing a black sleeveless dress. I want to thank the JANES directors, Tia Lessin and Emma Pildes, for being here, because this is just such an important film, and it's just so timely and relevant and just fascinating from start to finish. Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of shocking to think that 50 years after all of this, we're still debating and talking about this, and it's still a socio-cultural, political football that everybody is still kicking around to the extent that we are. So, and of course, because of that, your film feels all the more relevant, disturbingly so, since the June decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. So we all feared this was coming, but it still came as a shock. When did you decide you needed to do this?
Mm-hmm. I am a white woman with dark blonde hair and a black t-shirt on and a bandana around my neck. Yeah, we started developing, very, very early development started when Trump got into office, 2016, 2017. Daniel Arcana, who's another producer on this film, started then. It seemed dire in a new way, as it did a lot of things. You know, they've been, the timing on this is serendipitous and not. You know, I mean, we couldn't have imagined that we would have aired on HBO in June, in the same month that the Dobbs decision came down and we lost Roe. But at the same time, they've been chipping away at this for 50 years since Roe came down. You know, the Hyde Amendment passed 3 years. The last 50 years, and it's been scary. So you never quite believe that it's going to happen. We've been living and enjoying this right for the last 50 years, and you can't quite believe it, but they've been hard at work. And you know, and when Trump started immediately packing the courts with his eyes set on the high court, it felt like a very valuable contribution that Tia and I could make to give these women a platform and let them bear witness to what this country looked like last time women didn't have a right to choose, and make a film that was, you know, a visceral experience of the fear and loneliness and isolation and condescension and death and injury that women went through and will go through and already are going through in this country because of that. So,
and with that in mind, I mean, were you already familiar with the story of the JANES? Is this something that you guys connected on, or did someone bring it to you? How did you decide? Because there's a lot of ways you could approach that whole issue, and this is such a wonderful and personal way. How did you kind of land on this story and telling it in the way that you did?
Yeah, I mean, the Jane, very few people know about the Jane story, or very few people knew before this past year. And because it was illegal activity, and these women had moved on in their lives, 50 years had passed, and they, led happy lives after Roe, and they were no longer engaged in this illegal work. So there was a book written about the Janes by Laura Kaplan, and that was a lovely and very thorough account of the service. The women used pseudonyms, but they weren't, again, they weren't out as former Janes. But thankfully, and I knew about them because I had that book on my shelf. It was part of the feminist lore. So when Emma came to me with the story, Emma has a family connection to the story, and so she sort of had heard about these exploits for many years, and so when she came to me, I knew that it was such a dramatic story, a powerful story, and it happened to be right after Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed by the Senate, and so it felt like an urgent story to tell, and a way personally for me to channel some of the outrage that I was feeling, and put it to work, harness it to tell the story about these ordinary women turned outlaws in service of humanity.
How hard was it to track these women down? Because I know that that the story is out there, and obviously Laura Kaplan's book, but in terms of finding as many people as you did, what was that process like?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. My family connection helped. Let's just say that, you as a filmmaker, you hope and pray for a good family connection to a story like this. And the women had stayed in touch, some of them over the years. So we were sort of able to get our core crew, not that they were all ready to sit in front of our camera. I mean, that took talking to them and them understanding that we were on the up and up in the process, and so it took some time. And then also, we worked really hard to find these sort of secondary characters in the film that revealed themselves to be really important. The doctor that worked on the septic abortion ward at the Cook County Hospital, the nurse that worked on that ward, the homicide detective that was there for the one bust of the Janes. So as we sort of had our core group and they told their story, we then started to expand our thinking and decide what were these secondary characters that we needed to find. So that took a little bit more work. Also, women that used the service, that was almost the most challenging.
Yeah, I would think it would be.
Because the Janes aren't going to tell us that, and nor do they remember names necessarily. And we had those index cards that were sort of intake cards, but we weren't going to pursue that. That wasn't the right thing to do. So that was a challenge. What we ended up doing was we put an ad in the Chicago Reader. I mean, we went really old school documentary filmmaking with it. And we put an ad in the paper when we had sort of hit enough walls that we didn't know what to do and how to crowdsource. And we got incredibly lucky with Dory, who responded and opens our film. And she had had the experience of having a mob abortion in Chicago at the time, and years later having an abortion with Jane. So we had in one person somebody that could sort of A/B that experience and tell us how dramatically different and sort of life-changing, as you can tell from our interview, the Jane experience was. So it was a combo of the family connection, but also a lot of detective
Research.
work and
Detective
hard.
And not least of all was Mike, the abortionist that the Janes
Yeah.
found and worked with. He was quite the character, and
Yeah.
we had to restrain ourselves a lot. We had to
Yeah.
restrain ourselves because he was a secondary character, and but there was so much fascinating stuff that came out of his mouth, and so we were very judicious. So yeah, I just to add, and by the way, I didn't describe myself for those low vision or blind in the audience. I am a brunette, medium length hair with a blue shirt. I'm a white woman, and I'm sitting on a white couch with tan curtains behind me. But what I wanted to say, just to add to what Emma said, is, it's an ensemble cast, and we didn't, one of the interesting things about these women is that many of them hadn't talked about their involvement with the Janes, for 50 years. It's not like they'd been walking around town, dining out on this story. They were, first of all, it's a very illegal activity. It was also very stigmatized. Having an abortion was stigmatized, getting an abortion even more so. And, so brave of them to sit down with us and talk to us on camera for the world to see. They also, as women, didn't feel that their voices in and of themselves were that important. And we had to, coax them and tell them, you have a unique perspective, and you're part of this ensemble cast, and we really want to tell the breadth of the story. And it was important for us to find, and cast Janes. Some of them had kids, some didn't. Some were students, some were professionals, some were, unemployed and working class and privileged. So it was sort of a whole range of voices that we wanted to get in there, and in particular Marie Leaner, the Black Jane, who to us was, just key in terms of excavating, the racial injustice of it all, and the racial dynamics going on in this very segregated city in that moment.
Yeah, and that same racial sort of duality or problem occurs now with people who want to get an abortion now, and they need to travel, just like they talked about, those who could travel to New York and had the wherewithal to do that versus, now if you could travel to New York or to California or states where it's, so there's a lot of echoes of what we're going through now.
The present is catching up with the past.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the index cards, though, because I feel like they're a story in themselves. And I was so fascinated with notes like, be careful, her father is a cop, or just terrified, probably summed up how many people felt. Who was it that kept the index cards, or did they all keep them? How did that?
We're not going to rat them out. There was a big ceremony at the end of the service, and most of the cards were burned. They had a big bonfire. They listened to a Bob Dylan album, and but I think some of these just were kept for the purposes of statistics. I think they were looking at how many procedures they performed, what percentage of them had complications, what age groups and whatnot. So one of the Janes had kept this in a blue Samsonite suitcase in her basement, along with photographs and doctor's lists and thank you notes that came to the service from the women they served. And for us, I mean, it was stunning to see this, to see these cards. They were proxies of these, 10,000 women that the Janes served, and we couldn't meet them all, but we could get a sense of them. And also, the notes that were jotted down were from the counselors. So it was a way to have some insight into that. But we were very protective of them because obviously they had personal information, sensitive information, and there were, we couldn't use them in any way, in a revealing way. But those words, father's a cop, be cautious, or doesn't like pain, or scared, felt, you know, as it felt a way to bring those women's voices out. And then when we put them in the hands of the Janes, when we were interviewing them, it just it grounded them so deeply in this thing that they were so involved in 50 years ago. It was like it was yesterday. It just helped bring a lot to the surface.
I would think, yeah. Well, I feel like such an important lesson about, you know, how the absence of justice and political power and inequality can spur collective action. And I think one woman called herself a warrior for justice. I love the way, towards the end, someone else said, you know, we felt that this was, obviously we needed to do this, we did it, and then we're done, we go on to something else. But there's such heroic figures, and they were risking so much. I feel like there's a real kind of template there for future activists and for, you know, younger generations. I wondered if you, because as much as most of us don't know this story, I would think for younger women it's impossible for them to understand how you had to be married to get contraceptives, or you couldn't get a credit card, all that. What have you heard from younger women who have seen your film?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing Q&As with some of the women of Jane, which has been a joy. And there's a lot of young people that sort of rush the stage after the Q&As like they're rock stars, because they are, you know, and it's really, I think, thrilling for that generation to, and also those are, you know, often if we're on a college campus, those are 19-year-old men and women that are, the Janes were just about that age, some of them.
Yeah.
So it's a reminder of personal power. And that's the other side of why we made this film, right? We wanted to show what this country looked like when women don't have a right to choose, and all the fallout and the horror that comes from that. But we also wanted to show that that you always have the opportunity to be decent and to do the decent thing and to be kind to one another and to organize with that ethos in mind. We had a Q&A last night where a woman at the back of the room who was a USC student, but from Texas, asked if we had words of encouragement, you know, that she felt very sad about what was happening in her home state, and you know, not even necessarily what exactly do we do, but just some encouragement. It's a scary time, and these women at 19 years old, you know, they have a long time of being of reproductive age, and being vulnerable to what's going on in this country. So you know, I think we just said, remember your own personal power. Remember that Diane, one of the Janes, said last night, you know, they were us and we were them. You know, it's that that's what it is. You know, you have to protect one another as if you were protecting your own self. So I think there's many very practical ideas of organizing in this, but that personal power message was another reason we really wanted to make the film, and create some inspiration in what's going to be a really tough, long road.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when we think about that, this is it's so dire and it's grim. And yet one of the things I really appreciated about your film was that the tone of it was, there was some wry humor. It wasn't, you know, certainly it could have been much darker or just grimmer. And, you know, obviously that came from a lot of the discussions from the Janes, but it's something that really stood out to me. Is that something you discussed before filming or during filming, that you wanted to have that?
You know, it wasn't, I don't think it was part of the treatment. You know, I think it emerged, first of all, because, as you said, the Janes were they're spirited, they're dynamic, they you know, they took what they did seriously, but I don't think they took themselves that seriously, mostly.
Interesting.
Emma and I like to laugh. Like, we just found ourselves, you know, finding, you know, there's some dark humor, but there's just some, you know, it's life, you know, there's just good and happy moments. And I think we tried to use the humor, we leaned into it also strategically. because there's a lot of, hard truths that we were showing and hearing about. And so if you were, like before we got into the septic abortion ward, which, was just a really, we worried that people wouldn't be able to get beyond that. So we have that laugh with Eileen, where she talks about having smoked dope after she'd found her friend and helped her friend. And it's sort of like a nice moment of emotional relief that kind of takes you from this difficult story of finding a friend or a classmate hemorrhaging on her floor, gives you a chance to kind of take a deep breath and then move on to the next difficult thing. So it was really hard to have a virtual Sundance because we couldn't see the audience or hear the audience be impacted. So the first time we screened it, and they were laughing at all the moments that we found funny, that was a huge relief. It was a huge relief because, we thought, well, maybe we're just slap happy by this time, but in fact, yeah, we need it all. We need, and I guess the other thing I'd say is that we didn't want to care. This is a medical procedure that some is traumatic for some, is a relief for others. It's painful for some, and it's like painless for, so it's like, it's very, people experience this in very, very different ways. But I think audiences, the last thing we want to do is make an abortion film that no one wants to see. We wanted to make it engaging and entertaining. That, we didn't want to point fingers.
Yeah, no, and that's not an easy thing to do, I would think. And I wanted to ask you about Mike, because were you surprised that he spoke as candidly as he did? I didn't know whether to sort of admire him or to be kind of.
I know. Us either.
Like, what was his motivation? I don't know, but yeah, were you surprised at how candidly he spoke about it? And
that was a long, great. Tia did that interview, incredible interview, challenging interview. She had to just about scream the entire way through so he could hear.
Oh.
And I don't know that I was surprised by how candid he was, but it was clear that he was an incredible character from the documentary gods. The complexity of him was such a from a filmmaking perspective, was an incredible gift for our narrative. And from the perspective of his place within the Janes, it's just so telling. This is what they had to work with. He was a great guy in that he was kind to the women. He was gentle. He didn't sexually assault them. He didn't take advantage. I mean, the bar is pretty low.
I know. I was going to say that's supposed to be getting a pat on the back for not sexually assaulting people.
I know, but he really was all those things, and they could see that, and he was willing, and it was sort of symbiotic between them. I mean, he learned a great deal. They changed his life too, certainly. And gave him sort of a worldview and perspective that he didn't have access to or wasn't aware of before. So, I mean, he's a wild character for us to have in the film.
Yeah.
Very telling of what was going on then. And, you can feel it to add to what Tia was saying about being in these audience situations that we were sort of deprived of during the pandemic. We're like, when are people going to laugh? How are they going to take him? Are they going to be horrified? Or are they going to see sort of his humor and this gentle but complicated, kid that grew up on the streets of Chicago and sort of worked with the mob? So So it's very telling in a lot of different ways, and we're really grateful that he was willing to sit down with us, because the film wouldn't quite be the same without him.
No, that is true. And I also think, no matter, for people watching this, no matter where you stand on the abortion issue, your documentary highlights one thing that we can all agree on, and one major reality is that whether it's legal or not, abortion is always going to happen. And if you know that, then why not have it be as safe and legal as possible? So that's kind of, it seems like that's a given underlying.
That's right. And I mean, before Mike, there was a very skilled doctor in the form of TRM Howard, this doctor who had been chased out of Mississippi, had set up a above board clinic with nurses, and and it was completely tricked out and he saw patients every day, and he did abortions on the side, and he had a really good record, and he was a trained surgeon with a medical license, and he was taken out by the Chicago police. So
do you think the fact that he was a Black man also, I mean, had he been a white man doing that, he might have?
I think so. I think they all paid protection money. I think he just didn't pay enough. I don't think he worked with the mob, so he didn't have that level of protection. And yeah, I think he was more vulnerable.
Yeah.
But he served a lot of women. That story needs to be told. Yeah.
Yeah. That, I feel like there's a lot of like, you could do documentaries don't usually do sequels, I guess, unless it's an inconvenient truth or something. But you could do a separate documentary on what these women have gone on to do. You mentioned that they were educators and activists and healthcare workers and writers, and I was fascinated by the women. I wanted to know more about them. So you could do that. You could follow that doctor. There's just so many interesting things, and there's so many interesting facts. Like, I never realized how Catholic Chicago was.
Yeah.
There's just,
and the fact that clergy, not Catholic, but mainline clergy, Protestant clergy, rabbis were counseling women in that time period and facilitating their travel to get abortion care. I mean, that was a story that is little known. It was before the religious right hijacked this this issue for political reasons, and I found a lot of comfort in knowing that they were out there, not just in Chicago, but throughout this country, throughout the Midwest, East Coast, West Coast, everywhere. And I hope that it makes it clear that it's not a religious issue.
Right. Well, and you're speaking to the clergy people, I think that obviously that I think there are people, again, young people, who probably don't know that. They just assumed it's always been a religious issue.
Yeah.
So
and that's what you hope when you're making a documentary is that you learn things that you didn't know. That you ask questions you don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
That people open up in ways that didn't come out in the pre-interview, but it's just like, what? You work for the clergy consultation service and you had 2 abortions, and I mean, tell me. So it's like, those are wonderful moments, and that if you're, as a filmmaker, surprised, experiencing that surprise or that interest, the audience is going to feel that too. Yeah,
absolutely. There was a case where, or there was a line where one of the Janes says, "This is a case where men underestimating women's abilities worked very well for us." And I thought that was a really putting a positive spin on something.
Great. Yeah.
So there was that whole undercurrent of sort of the male dominance, even in ironically, in things like civil rights, which is all about equity. You just got that, or with the anti-war movement, all of that, the idea that women were still such second-class citizens.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
Oh, go ahead. No, please.
I was just wondering if the women talked more about that, and if they see a difference between where they are now versus where they were then. But I want to hear your point too.
Yeah, no, I just that it was clear and so interesting to us that sort of the women's movement was sort of the last frontier in
Yeah.
all of those movements, and to understand that they grew out of those movements and were relegated to helper roles, but listened and learned and learned how to organize and took all of that with them. And you see how that manifests in Jane. I mean, they were just so brilliantly organized. They were so smart about how they were able to bring their life experiences, the shortcomings of the medical industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, into the Janes. And, Jody says we talked and talked and talked before we set out to do this work. So they really had an ethos set, and they knew how to from a practical, I mean, they had the front and the place and the car in between, and so it was exciting, interesting, inspiring, all of those things, and all of that came out of these movements. And so interesting, as you're saying, that it was because they were sort of relegated to the sidelines, and that they took their savvy elsewhere, and did for themselves something that wasn't being done. So we knew we had to get that in. That was sort of a story in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I love, just as a person who grew up in the 60s, I love the fact that you included Graham Nash's Chicago song at the end, because it's so perfect. We can change the world and all that. How did you decide on that? And I also really liked your score, by the way, because there was it was beautiful, but there was also a little ominous aspect to it, because there should be. And I wanted to ask a little bit about the musical underpinnings.
Yeah.
Emma, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the score is Max Avery Lichtenstein, who's a brilliant genius, another gift from the documentary gods. He came in and we said, don't think about this as a abortion documentary. We're making a heist film. And he really got that. And we had to, I mean, there were moments, of course, of the septic word, of many serious moments that he calibrated to beautifully. But this 70s heist genre, inverted as a feminist heist film, was a very exciting idea for us. And we went into the making of this with that notion. And so he got that right away, and it was just such a successful collaboration with Max. We were just so excited, with all of it. He would send stuff and we go, yep, that's it. I mean, when does that happen? And so it was that was great. So hugely excited to have worked with him. And then we wanted to bring in a couple of cues from the time.
Yeah.
We tried a lot of stuff out. And we had a Dylan song at the end for a while that didn't feel quite right. And then we hit on the Graham Nash song. It almost felt too on the nose. I mean, it's called Chicago, it says we can change the world.
Yeah.
But when we put it there, sonically, emotionally, rhythmically, all those things, that was it, I mean, it was just so clearly right. So,
and I'll just add the Tina Turner song, Can't You Hear Me Calling, that is set against the montage of the movement, the conflict between the abortion rights and anti-abortion movements in the early 70s, was just a beautiful, beautiful choice. And Emma found that. I will credit where credit's due. I'd never heard that song, but what was so wonderful about that was that she had personally experienced such abuse in her relationship with Ike, and she has revealed not, I think pretty recently, that she had to undergo an illegal abortion in 1968.
Mm.
And there was a lot of pain associated with that, and with that relationship. And anyhow, it was so beautiful to have her voice in that moment, giving voice to those feelings of frustration and anger and can't you hear me calling, like, listen to me.
Yeah, yeah. As the last question, I want to ask how you both feel like, were you changed by doing this? What were you left with emotionally after the making of this?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question. I think as we were making this film, these, COVID was happening. And so we were watching a healthcare crisis affect disproportionately people of color, low income communities. And then we were working with this story that was, where illegal abortion was doing the same thing. And I think the impact of that was pretty deep and profound to understand who really is going to be most harmed. I had an abortion in my younger years, and I never really talked about it. I mean, I don't think I was ashamed of it, but I didn't think that it's like, I'm not going to tell you about my knee surgery. Why would I tell you about my abortion,
Yeah. But you most likely would tell more about your knee surgery than
exactly, I have. But, knowing that, hearing these voices, first of all, people taking, some risk to tell their stories gave me some, I guess, some courage to be able to say, hey, this is, and to normalize it, to destigmatize it, that there's something important about that. And to also maybe challenge the gender norm that all women should welcome pregnancy or motherhood at any given moment. And that, the norm that, sex is for procreation. I mean, all that is sort of packed into this idea of abortion being illegal. So I don't know, there was a lot of appreciation I think I gained from my own story and from, this older generation of women, who really led the way and were fearless. And as I approach their age, I just feel kind of excited, to be able to tell some stories.
It's so inspiring. It's like I looked at them all and I'm like, that's how I want to be. That's, yeah, like they're just, every one of them was so cool.
Yeah.
Emma, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, this reminder of personal power. I think that was really being able to sit with these women at such a scary time, as Tia was saying, in the middle of a pandemic, and be able to go to them every day, and collaborate with Tia and collaborate with our editor, Kristen Huntley, and have our own sort of sisterhood unit working to make this film about this extraordinary group of women, and to be able to connect with their insight and their ability to organize and affect change, and do it from a place of morality and goodness, and that is, with an open heart, what led them. They saw people suffering, and they felt that it was their responsibility. And so that's a message that I will, always keep with me, or if I stray from it, go back to, forever. And so it was a gift, especially at that time, to be able to be breathing that in and taking that in and making that part of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great message that we should all take from it. Just when you see that, and when you see people suffering, help. Yeah. It's not, it doesn't happen often enough, but how wonderful when it does. And I'm so glad that you guys documented this. Thank you so much, Emma and Tia and Andrea, for your interpretation as well. Thank you. And I hope you all enjoyed it, and tell your friends to watch it. Everybody out there.
Thank you so much, Claudia. So
Yeah, thank
enjoyed
you,
this
Claudia.
conversation.
So did I. Thank you.